It's a pleasure to be with all of you again. And it's very nice to see the realtor in the room that sold me my very first home that I'm still in, Miss Donna Carson. So, and do you remember how many houses I made you go look at? It was one. I bought the house I was renting. That's called an easy client. And that's me. I said, I'm only looking at houses within a 1 block radius of where I live. What do you got for me? Okay. So I love Columbus. I did not grow up here. And show of hands, how many of you did not grow up in Franklin, one of the counties that touch Franklin? How many of you grew up somewhere else in the state of Ohio? Outside Ohio, but in the US? And anybody from outside the United States? Okay. That gives me a really good indication because it doesn't really matter what group I'm presenting to. You normally see that kind of distribution because we're a growth market, which means there's not a lot of people who are in any room that are longtime Columbus folks. And I don't know if we could just dim the lights a little bit. That is crisp, but you know, it's a cold, rainy day. I'm going to talk about census numbers, so let's not try to fall asleep. So I'll start with this image that I love telling the story. It was a 1991 dark comedy film with Stockard Channing and Ed Begley Jr. And they are, of course, insects, as you see here in this depiction. And they were living in the Amazon rainforest and were very upset at the global warming behaviors of Americans in 1991. And they wanted to do something about it. And what they were going to do was become humans, come to the United States and dismantle an energy plant. At the beginning of the movie, Ed Begley Jr., who's now become human, is looking at census data to figure out where they live and be so anonymous that they're going to be the stereotypical suburban American family. 1991, Stockard Channing needed to be a stay-at-home mom. The kids had to get B's in school, not A's, not C's. And he's like, where should we live? So he starts going through the census data and he finds that the most statistically average place in the United States in 1990 was Columbus, Ohio. That there was not a single fact about Columbus that made this an interesting place. And so this film took place in a fictitious town called Median, Ohio. Right? And for the longest time, this was our claim to fame, right? This is why products were tested here. This is why companies wanted to see if they could sell things in Columbus. They could sell it here, then it was good for the United States. So fast forward, what I'm going to do with you today. So for those of you that have seen this, this is a refresher course. I've changed some things around. I've added some things. Since my presentation in February, the 1-year American Community Survey data came out, and it is wonky as you could possibly imagine due to COVID. As one quick example, in the last census, the decennial census, 1 US state lost population. And in the last 12-month period, 18 US states had negative population growth. That has never happened in American history. And in fact, about 75% of all US counties had more people die than being born. Also has never happened. So I don't like to stick with those 1 year because I think COVID just changed all of the trends, but it's not here to stay. So we're going to stick with the decennial census, but I have some of those 5-year ACS, particularly on New Americans, I've included for us today. So the big issue is, as we all know, Central Ohio is growing. We have been 90% of the state of Ohio's population growth between 2010 and 2020. Again, in that 1-year estimate, Central Ohio added 10,000 people, but the rest of Ohio lost 20,000 people in the most recent 12-month period. And if you look at our metropolitan region, the growth of the region is slowly ticking up. And by the way, if I see a couple of you taking notes, you will get a copy of all of the slides, so don't feel the need to be jotting everything down. The growth of the region has only been 18%. Where that growth occurs dramatically shifted in this decade. So in that period between 2000 and 2010, just 43% of metro growth happened in Franklin County. In the most recent census, 70% of population growth happened in Franklin County. I believe in many ways it's because the diversity of the housing stock in Franklin County in particular is quite different. And if you look at Licking and Delaware and Fairfield counties, they don't have the same diversity of housing stock that's in Franklin County. And given the type of households we've been adding, those households are needing stuff that's in Franklin County. So here we are. The city actually jumped San Francisco and Indianapolis, but Fort Worth jumped us. We moved up one more notch to be the 14th largest city in the country at now 906,000 people. But in the last decade, it was the fastest growth in the city of Columbus in 70 years. And in fact, it was the largest numeric increase in Columbus's history in any 10-year period. If you compare the city of Columbus to many West Coast and Sunbelt cities, it is surprising to many people to see that we rank so competitively with many of those major cities that are considered the growth hubs of the United States. Now, these metropolitan regions are growing faster than Columbus Metro. This is really an indication of how much growth occurred in Columbus proper. If you've been around here long enough, you know that annexation is what drives our city. We were the first city in the United States to create an act of the state legislature to be its Bay capital. But Columbus grew very, very slowly. But this annexation over time is what really defined us as a very unique place in the country, but certainly in the Midwest. When you look at our city today at 222 square miles, and you look at this really incoherent map, it is very difficult for newcomers to Columbus to understand, well, how can I be in Columbus, Texas, but Hilliard schools, but my zip code is Dublin, right? It's very confusing. It's also further confusing in that there are 5 suburbs that are entirely surrounded by Columbus, but we also have a situation in our city where, right, Columbus is about 50 feet on Morse Road between New Albany and Gahanna, or how Columbus comes between Dublin and Hilliard, and how Columbus came down here to get the old Rickenbacker Air Force Base, all of those jobs. For a long time, Columbus's financial strength and population growth was really driven by the territorial expansion of the city. That ended in this period. Land area of Columbus grew just 1.5%. The population jumps 15%. But we added 119,000 people into the existing city. Not a single neighborhood in our city has been unaffected by this kind of growth in such a short period of time. And we're going to unpack that a little bit in certain neighborhoods, and then we're going to dive into some of the diversity implications of these changes. We are now a city that is going vertical in addition to continuing to going outward, but things are starting to shift. You see that downtown. You see it in this example of projects happening in all those near downtown neighborhoods. We'll talk about in a little bit. We also see it happening in suburban Columbus. The density, the mixture of uses, the scale of these projects are the likes of which we have never seen until this last 10-year period. The one I like to point out is Bridge Park in Dublin, top right, which is really a failed single-story strip mall. Dublin is starting to realize that it needs to appeal to a different kind of consumer, because 2-person adult households with school-age children is not going to be the growth trajectory of the future. And either young people or empty nesters are really driven by the same 2 things, lifestyle and convenience. And Dublin is starting to create a different kind of environment to continue to capture those different kind of households. And they're doing it very effectively, as is Worthington and Upper Arlington and other places. But if you compare what happened here, we really bucked the national trend. At the bottom of this slide, and you can see that growth in the United States slowed dramatically from 9.7 to 7.4%. Growth in America was the slowest since the 1930s, and in the last 12 months, growth in the United States was 0.2%. That was the impact of COVID. While growth in America slowed by 26%, growth in Columbus increased 50%, and growth in Franklin County also increased about 50%. We bucked that national trend. The other thing that happened in this decennial census is every single community in Central Ohio posted growth. You see here in blue, all of those communities that are growing faster than the Franklin County average. Those places in orange are growing, but not as fast as the Franklin County average. What's important to note here, inner ring communities, Whitehall, Bexley, Grandview, Arlington, Worthington, communities that don't have greenfield development sites grew in population. And you saw high growth markets on the north end, which has been our historical growth corridor, Dublin, Powell, New Albany, but we have high growth communities like Grove City and Canal Winchester and Pickering. This is the most equitably distributed we've seen our growth patterns in some time. To put this in perspective, there are 44 more people living in Franklin County at the end of every day than at the beginning of that day. And on an annual basis, we add an entire Bexley or an entire city of Worthington just to Franklin County every 12 months. So here's the county. County's up 13.8%. What you see on this map in green and yellow are all the places that are growing, and the places in red experience population loss. I'm going to point out these two places. One of those places is the West Side, from Coastside all the way out to Hollywood Casino, West Broad, Sullivan Avenue. I'll pause here to say the decennial census is a 10-year snapshot. I know things on the West Side are starting to change. That change has been very, very recent. But the West Side is still struggling under the weight of social issues, perception, and crime and violence, and the opioid epidemic. And it continues to not really be a neighborhood of choice for many consumers. The surprising thing for me, and by the way, I have degrees in urban geography and a master of city and regional planning, but I'm investing those dollars into the nonprofit sector, right? The nonprofit sector is the social mortar between the bricks and sticks. It's really important for us to understand the landscape as we make our investments at United Way. The place that surprised me that showed multiple contiguous census tracts that lost population was the entire South Side. So Miller, Kelton, Whittier, everything east of Parsons, that area lost population, not because it's in decline, but because it's on the rapid rise. And what we now know is that renter families with school-age children are often getting replaced with single buyers or a two-income buyer that do not have school-age children, as those home prices are really doubling and tripling in a relatively short period of time, as the renovation of that housing stock has really gone full throttle. Why is that? Because we're adding lots of high-paying jobs in the core of the city. I think right now there are 21 cranes between Lane Avenue and Livingston in the core of the city, which represents about $5 billion in construction in that zone. That's driving that demand. And I'll say it now so I don't forget. A house is where a job goes at night. And we've been a region very, very strong at attracting jobs. We've not been as good as a market in attracting housing construction, which we'll get into a little bit. The point of these two examples, the West Side and the South Side, if we look at a single indicator, like population growth or population decline, for 50, 60 years, a neighborhood that showed population decline suggested that's a neighborhood that people don't want to be in, and they're picking up and moving out. And if a neighborhood is growing, that must mean a neighborhood on the rise. That relationship is no longer true anymore. And you'll see that here in a minute. Despite the attention about the inward growth, much of the last decade was like every other decade, which is a lot of the growth of the region was new construction on greenfield sites near the Beltway on the edges of Franklin County. But all of the growth in the city of Columbus, the largest growth in our history, all of it was due to increases in diversity and people of color. And all of the growth of Franklin County was due to increases in diversity. The white population in Columbus and Franklin County actually fell despite the fact that it was a significant growth period. Here are the numbers. I won't read them. You can scan them. Some of this is how the census uses labels and how we no longer think some of these labels accurately reflect who we are. So previously, there may have been some of us in the room that identified as Black or identified as white, and now we think two or more or some other race really more accurately reflects our personal family history. So some of this is shifting in how people identify, and really the loss of the white population is really statistically insignificant. It is only significant because the growth was so robust across the entire region, just not in that category. This shows everywhere in Franklin County where diversity increased. And what you can see is it is everywhere. The increase in diversity for the county, our diversity index from 50 to 60. The increase in diversity was not an urban Columbus thing or a suburban Columbus or an inner ring suburb or just an outer ring suburb. It was everywhere. There were just a few places, a few tracts that are not as diverse as what they once were. That's only because they were very diverse in 2010. They're still diverse today. They're just not as diverse because either a bunch of new housing was either built or housing was demolished in those places, which changed the demographics of who's in that spot. Despite this increase in diversity, this is what the map currently looks like with regard to diverse communities and homogeneous communities. Everywhere in red are those places that are very homogeneous. We can ignore this area of southern Franklin County because these are huge tracts. Not a lot of people live there. It's very rural, very agricultural, and we would expect those places to be very homogeneous. But there are 6 places I want to point out that are very homogeneous. Bexley, German Village, Grandview Heights, Upper Arlington, Clintonville, and Worthington. What's interesting about that is 2 of them are in the city of Columbus, 4 of them are in inner ring suburbs. There really are not homogeneous places in the newer suburbs. And 5 of the 6 places were really impacted by redlining and segregation. And the distribution of diversity in 2020 still looked a lot like 1920 in those places. Now, German Village aside, right? Some of these the other 5 places had those redlining and policies that supported segregation. We have to begin to ask ourselves, well, why is it decades after these policies have been changed, why is it that certain parts of the community are not seeing an increase in diversity? Yet, if you look at this map, Dublin and New Albany may be homogeneous through the lens of income. They're not homogeneous places through the lens of race and culture, because Dublin and New Albany, which have entirely been built in the post-civil rights era, right, really do reflect a modern version of a suburban community culturally, even though they represent that homogeneity economically because of how those communities were built. So as I went in last week to update this presentation, the census also has now reported that while they got the top line numbers correct for America, they overcounted some people and undercounted others. And they've now reported that they overcounted white residents by 1.6%, Asian by 2.6%, and undercounted Black and Hispanic. When you look at this ratio and apply it to the size of that population, it leaves the United States top line number unchanged. If we apply the national to Franklin County, this is what happened. We undercounted about 10,000 Black and about 4,500 Hispanic. We overcounted 13,000 white and about 2,000 Asian. So all of these huge shifts in diversity in Franklin County were slightly underreported. We're even more diverse than what the official 2020 census has reported. They do not go back and change those numbers. The numbers for 2020 are what they are, and they will stay that way. But it is helpful that the census can do additional sampling and understand where they get things a little off. And 2020 was a very, very difficult year to do the census. So where are the fastest growing places in all of Franklin County? 3 of them were greenfield sites, and 3 of them are in existing neighborhoods. 2 of them on the top right are City of Columbus next to New Albany. The other one top left is that wedge of Hayden Run between Dublin and Hilliard that also includes portions of Dublin and Hilliard. And the other 3 are in the core, 5th by Northwest and 2 tracks in downtown Columbus. This is significant because it does represent that shift that we could have really high growth neighborhoods on the urban periphery and high growth places with already built out infrastructure and well-established neighborhoods. Clearly, downtown Columbus showed huge population growth, as did every single downtown in the United States. In places like Detroit, Cleveland, and Youngstown, which are still losing population, all saw huge increases in their downtown and near downtown populations. And in places like that, they have lost people of color dramatically in Detroit and Cleveland, and they're gaining white residents, which is the opposite experience as Columbus. In addition to downtown, there's this whole groundswell that's really circling around downtown. This is about 14 tracks that run from Grandview Yard, 5th by Northwest, North, Italian Village, Wineland Park, King Lincoln, Schumacher Place. It's really a wave that came into that center. As land prices are really jumping in this colored zone, what I believe this decade you will see is it's really going to be the Broad Street corridor, both east and west, for the period of 2020 to 2030. You will continue to see growth in this zone just based on the things that are moving through. But as we all know in this area, large developable sites for the 5 and 6 and 7 buildings are becoming fewer and fewer. So now let's move into some neighborhoods. I was really surprised. 11 of 12 tracts in Linden showed population growth. After 60 years of population loss, Linden is a growing neighborhood. As someone who implemented the Greater Linden Plan in one of my first jobs out of grad school, I was surprised when I saw this number. I thought, oh, well, maybe there's a really large development that was built in a particular tract, and that's what really resulted in this growth in Linden. When you start to look at each census tract, you realize that there's something far more systemic at play. Linden grew by about 2,600 people. It grew by about 7% in population. That's a pretty healthy rate of growth. But Linden is still losing its housing stock. There are 652 less housing structures in Linden than 10 years earlier. Another example where these trends have shifted. This has not happened before, where a neighborhood is in the modern era, where a neighborhood is losing housing, but adding population. Because normally for someone like myself, as much as I look at numbers, I kind of need to see buildings going up to give me that physical representation that growth is occurring. You don't have that in Linden. What our nonprofit sector has been telling us for years, that what the census now confirms is that as people get evicted, right? There were 1,700 evictions filed in March. Actually, January, February, and March were not good months. 2022 is not starting off great. That when people are living doubled up, if you can't afford the place that you are and you're moving in with a family member, a cousin, a friend, that really is happening in neighborhoods where they're already struggling, right? People are not living doubled up in Clintonville and German Village and Grandview. Right? The number of vacant structures in Linden fell by about 1,100. Linden has been the focus both the Pullman administration and the Ginther administration. I'd love to say the growth of Linden is really because of those efforts. I believe the growth of Linden is because of chronic underbuilding in the housing market and the growth of the region and more people living in the same housing unit. In fact, Linden and Northland, since the end of World War II, we've been getting fewer and fewer people living in the typical American home. That trend stopped and reversed itself. And in places like Northland and Linden, the number of people per unit went from 2.2 to 2.6, which is really an indication of that kind of doubling up. So the number of vacant units is down 1,100, but the city wanted to remove blight in Linden. They did that effectively, and the city took down 403 structures during that 10-year period. Now, that suggests that the private market absorbed those other 700 units by repurposing them, bringing them back online. If we think of the Linden housing stock, it's not that old, particularly as you move up Cleveland Avenue. The housing stock is not large homes. They are relatively modest to bring back online because we're not talking about a 3,500 square foot 1880s Queen Anne home on the Near East Side. You can bring this house back relatively easily, and I believe that's what happened. What's also interesting when we look at Linden, while the white population fell for the city and it fell for Franklin County, statistically insignificant, but it inched up for Linden. And the growth of Linden was not because of the Black population growth, but because Linden is becoming more diverse. And this is what you're going to see through the entire presentation. Everywhere is getting more diverse. There might be different reasons for that, but it is resulting in a very different Central Ohio. Moving to Northland, which I believe is the most fascinating of all of the narratives. Every single census tract in Greater Northland, I've designed a larger geography that I call Greater Northland and its official boundaries because I'm representing a more important trend of the North City. Think about Northland. It has Polaris, Easton, John Glenn, downtown OSU. If the region's growing and we're not building housing and you're in a part of the city that is surrounded by massive employment centers in every direction, it's impossible that Northland and Linden can't get caught up into that wave. Eastland and Westland are not caught up into that wave. Because if you think about Eastland, the city just kind of, peters out. And once you leave the casino, it kind of peters out, right? Linden Northland added the equivalent of the city of Bexley in a 10-year period. Right? 14,000 more people live in Northland. Yet there's only 484 more housing units in that entire area. I'll say it again, 484 more housing units with 14,000 more people. This is a huge, huge shift. The fact that Northland outpaced the city and outpaced Franklin County, that Northland is a growth leader, but you really don't see any construction, is fascinating to me. Because in many ways, this is what drove it. Northland had the largest reduction in vacant housing in anywhere in Franklin County in the last 10 years. 48% of all of those vacant units in Northland disappeared in the decade. And what does Northland have? Stuff like this, right? I snatched this from Google Street View. It's a 2011 picture of an apartment complex on Northtown Boulevard near Tamarack Circle. Here's that same apartment complex today, right? Wouldn't have taken a lot of work to bring that back online. So the number of units is up by 7%, but the number of people is double that growth. Mainly because the global diaspora is playing out in all those neighborhoods along Morse Road and 161. Before the war in Ukraine, there were 81 million people on the planet forcibly removed from their homes. 23 million of them were refugees. And we in Central Ohio tend to be a destination for new American populations. I'll just point out the one line here, Asian, which went from 2,000 to 7,600. Most of that is Nepali Bhutanese. And for those of us that have been around a long time, Northland was #1 in the state of Ohio for retail sales for zip code in 1997. You love my vintage picture of Sears. 10 years after the fall of Northland, that census, economic census, an Ohio Wesleyan geographer pulled every business permit issued by the city of Columbus and found that the 180 businesses that had Morse code, the vast majority of them had either an African or a Latino surname. In many ways, Morse code has become far more entrepreneurial, and the dollar is turning over more frequently in Northland because of the changing demographics. Personally, the Kroger that closed at Northern Lights, the Giant Eagle that closed at 161 and 71, I don't believe grocery store chains would be closing their stores in a neighborhood that just added 14,000 more people. They might have closed because they didn't know how to understand to shift their products to meet the demographics of who's in that community. So what do you see along Morse Road and 161? Lots of small markets, and you see some not so small markets like Lamicocana or Saraga. When you look at our region compared to the rest of the state, and this is what the UCS data just was able to give me, if you just look at Ohio and you take Metro Columbus out of the equation, just 3.8% of Ohio, minus Columbus Metro, was born outside the United States. For our Metro, it's 8.8%. And while we represent 18% of Ohio, we represent 24% of all new Americans who live in our state. As of the 2020 census, there were about 180,000 new Americans living in the metropolitan region. 81% of them are living in Franklin County, but Franklin County only represents 61% of the metropolitan region. So not only is our metro a leader in the state, but Franklin County tends to be the center within the metropolitan region. However, Delaware County is also quite significant in their percentage of new Americans. In fact, Delaware County, I believe, is the only county in the state of Ohio where the second largest racial group is not white, but it's Asian. Now let's move to the Near East Side. Lots of conversations about the Near East Side, and it doesn't seem as if you can go in any block without seeing a new house or a new apartment building. But believe it or not, the Near East Side population barely dropped. We have 5 I think most of that happened in just the last few years of that decade. What did happen on the Near East Side was the most dramatic, did I go too far? Was the most dramatic shift in racial distribution. The Near East Side, and I'm talking from 670 down to Livingston, downtown to Bexley. White population jumps 19 to 37%, and the black population fell from 75 to 58. What's important about understanding this most recent decade is we really have to think about neighborhoods in a longer term history. In red, you see north of Broad, from Broad to 670 downtown to Bexley, which has really been the heart of the Black community for a century in this community. its racial demographics just started to shift really in the last 20 years, but it accelerated in the last 10. Between Broad and Livingston and downtown and Bexley, we see this roller coaster, a neighborhood that went 4% Black, 40%, 80%. It stayed there for only 20 years, and now it has dramatically come down. This suggests to me, even on the Near East Side, conversations about race and class and history are nuanced and they're complicated, and we're not really having them. The Near East Side was third in Franklin County for its reduction in vacant and abandoned housing, down 34%, or about 1,200 less vacant structures on the Near East Side than the previous 10 years. We know it. You are realtors, so I don't have to explain any of this to you. I love the image in the top center, a property that was, a decade ago, 15,000, recently sold for 380,000. What we don't know, right, and what the census can't tell us, was 250,000 put into that house, or was it 75,000? Because when I go back to Google Street View and I look at these properties, it's like, oh yeah, well, it didn't have any windows and it didn't have a roof, right? There was a reason why that house was $15,000 even in 2011. You see this same kind of turnover, and this is what everybody feels, right? When you see a dramatic shift in racial demographics in your neighborhood, when you see these prices, it excites some and it gives others fear. And both of those are true. Who's in the center kind of bringing that conversation together and giving it clarity? So let's now go back to the county. Everywhere in green is where the Black population is rising. The Black population is really surging in suburban city of Columbus and in the suburbs, predominantly northeast and east suburbs. But what's really important here is look at all the places in the core of the city where the Black population is dropping, even though the Black population jumped by 21%, or about 50,000 people. What the census doesn't tell us, and what I would love to do with the Board of Realtors, is let's do a study. How much of this is displacement? How much of it is gentrification? And how much of this is choice? Because nobody really knows. And it leaves us all with anecdotes that I don't think are helpful. The number one place for the drop in the Black population was Franklinton. You see here a picture from 10 years earlier of called Riverside Bradley. It was a CMHA community. It was replaced by River and Rich. If the number of Black people in your neighborhood falls 60% in 10 years, you'll notice. Here's where the Black population is moving. 3 census tracts, 0.14, 0.09, and 0.15. They all touch each other, and they're all next to the city of New Albany. What you see here is Google satellite of a development called Upper Albany West, built by MI Homes. It had the largest increase in the Black population in all of Franklin County, where the Black population among these 3 tracts went from 800, about 900 to 2,800. And a year ago, New Albany High School started an official NAACP chapter, as 10% of New Albany High School is now Black. Where's the white population dropping? Well, there's some clarity here, right? Northland, Eastland, and Westland. Let's think about those places for just a second. What I like to say about those neighborhoods is it's a good housing stock. It's not very old. Doesn't really lend itself to gentrification because it's a relatively simple housing stock, often built in the 60s and 70s. It's not really cool enough yet to be the center of the gentrification model that we see closer to downtown. And the housing stock is aging and it needs significant capital improvements. So it's also generally not been holding up. One of the things I want to say about Northland is prices in Northland are jumping. That has nothing to do with gentrification, right? Because in most measures of economic stability, measured by earned income of the people who live in Northland, Northland is a weaker neighborhood than what it was 10 years earlier. The price jump there is because more and more low and moderate income people are competing against each other for that fixed supply of housing. Because even the housing that we're adding, whether it's rental or for sale, is really missing a big chunk of the market. As Columbus gets bigger, right, the number of people who are economically vulnerable is getting bigger. If our current rate of poverty and economic vulnerability, those between 100% and 200%, if those ratios hold true, and if we add 1 million people in the next 30 years, that means we have 300,000 more economically vulnerable people coming. and we're not building housing for them. So where might they go? I'm not looking for an answer, but I think you know. Largest decreases, Whitehall, Eastland, Northland. You know, one tract in Whitehall saw a 72% drop in its white population. Whitehall is growing after 50 years of population loss in many ways because older people are moving into an appropriate housing for where they are in the life cycle, and the replacement population tends to be younger families with school-age children, often new American. So if you look at the distribution in Whitehall elementary schools, it looks very different than the rest of Whitehall, which represents that new, robust diversity. And where is the white population jumping? Generally, those neighborhoods that had been redlined and segregated are seeing significant growth in the white population. And number one is Mount Vernon Avenue and Long Street, a 208% jump in the white population. Again, from Google Street View, I just snatched two houses on St. Clair, which really represent what's happening all over the Near East Side. So what does that mean? It means the Near East Side is getting more diverse, the same way New Albany is getting more diverse. We're all playing musical chairs, and it's good, and it has implications. So the Asian population has jumped 65%. What you see here in this map is where the Asian population lives and where the Asian population does not live. In red is where there are almost no Asians living in those communities. In green are where you have significant Asian populations. Near Ohio State, near Dublin, now Northland, New Albany, and Reynoldsburg, but they are different Asian communities. I've not been able to pull the data from the American Community Survey so I can map different Asian communities, but I promise when I get that done, you'll get the deck. And here we see not where the Hispanic population currently lives, but where the Hispanic population is growing. And all of those places in green recorded significant increases in the Hispanic population, as the Hispanic population and the Asian population saw similar increases. I'm gonna pick up my pace. All right, see, my energy came up. I was complaining I was low energy today. All right, the most diverse census tract in our entire metropolitan region is the area of West Broad, just outside 270 on the other side of Hollywood Casino, essentially behind the Home Depot. I recently visited the elementary school that serves that area, and it is incredibly diverse from all around the world. Northland as an entire area is the most diverse, but this census tract has the greatest diversity and the most homogeneous is Upper Arlington, essentially just south of Lane Avenue behind Whole Foods. So we'll do a quick little history lesson, but I know you already know it all. How do we have places that are incredibly diverse? How do we have places that are homogeneous? Zoning, when it first came to the United States, there were three types of zoning. There's racial zoning, expulsive zoning, and exclusionary. Expulsive is like, we want to make sure that factories aren't next to houses, right? It came from Germany. It was really about the built environment, but you know, America has to take its own little take on things like that. And so one of those things would be using zoning to organize a city around racial lines. And the very first example of a racial zoning code was the city of Baltimore, which in 1910 created a zoning code based on race lines, where they did divide the city up, and they said white people will live here and black people will live here. And there's a quote that you can read where they actually use the word quarantine because they believe that people of color could give white people communicable diseases. And this was the rationale to do a racialized zoning code. Well, the courts struck that down relatively quickly after it was implemented in this city plan, but it did move into restrictive covenants. It happened in every US city. We won't spend a lot of time here because you're all experts. I love the marketing brochure here for when the 1,000 acres south of Lane Avenue was released for sale. There were restrictions on lot sizes and around architecture. There was actually a picture in this brochure, which I should scan, that says, we don't want Upper Arlington to look like this. And it's a picture blocked from the house. And what that picture was single family homes and duplexes and row houses and commercial buildings, which my neighborhood was built for zoning. Upper Arlington wanted a more organized community. I took this from the book Planning in the Private Interest, printed by OSU Press. This slide was given to me by the Kerman Institute for the study of race and ethnicity, which really looks at all of the places in our community where restrictive covenants were used. It was not just a Columbus thing, it was also happening in the suburbs. And that 68% of all subdivisions platted in Franklin County were using some kind of restrictive covenant. The words on this slide are pretty offensive, but they are the actual words that were used over and over in those restrictive covenants. I did have a person come up to me when I gave this presentation at Arlington, and she says, "Oh my gosh, I have the original documentation to my house when it was originally built, and it said I'm not permitted to sell my house to a Black person until after 1999. The impacts of redlining are still being felt today. So if you just look at the period from 1980 to the present, Rice-Kinder did a study that said those places that were in tier 1 versus tier 4, the most desirable, least desirable, people are still building wealth in present day over these policies, even though they have gone away over half a century ago. Interestingly enough, if you compare that original redlining map on the left to a map done in 2010 by OSU's Kirwan Institute, which looks at private sector predatory loans that were issued, it's also buy here, pay here. You can see that while the government no longer allows this practice to take place, in many ways it's still occurring in marginal neighborhoods through private sector tools. Quickly, we have been chronically underbuilding for a decade. That is catching up to us in a very, very brutal way, as you all know. We have been chronically underbuilding for a decade. 2020 was the most permits in 15 years. It was still several thousand units less than what we needed in that year. And I was disappointed to see that in 2021, building permits actually slipped, mainly because multifamily fell by 18%. If you compare us to other similarly sized markets, we are underbuilding specifically relative to places like Nashville and Charlotte. Yes, they are growing more robustly, but even adjusted for that, we are not keeping pace with our peer cities. In fact, Raleigh was adding 1 unit for every 1 job. Columbus in the last decade added 1 unit for every 2.8 jobs. And now, as you all know, we have a critical scarcity of product at all price points, both in the rental market and the for sale market. And what we are often building doesn't really meet the demographic demands of what the population growth of Columbus is looking for, which is a lot of people are looking for smaller units, that accessory dwelling unit, in-law suites, other things, greater density. It's just really only now starting to happen in our market. When we look at Northland and Linden and the Near East Side, this county has 9,417 less vacant structures than 10 years earlier. And by the time the census was done, our housing vacancy rate was lower than San Francisco's. The repurposing of housing units that were in this community and didn't have anybody living in them allowed Franklin County to absorb 23,000 people without building a single structure. Now that that product of vacant housing has been significantly absorbed, the stuff that is vacant now either got serious structural issues or it has legal issues. And I'm not particularly optimistic that much of the vacant housing in this kind of number can be repurposed moving forward, which means if our growth rate continues and we can't get new construction up, I think our housing increases are likely to stay and may even accelerate, particularly with the impacts of Intel. You can see very quickly with some Google Street View, again, images of what's happened in Central Ohio in just a 10-year period. I took these pictures for just a point in time on a particular street to illustrate how quickly in a 10-year lifespan we can watch our region change. This is right by my house, by the way. East Long Street, I think this is where you live. Yeah. So someone just told me they live there. There's your apartment. Wait, where are you? Short north, no surprise. So what did we learn from all the census data? Our regional growth has been consistent, but it has shifted inward. Neighborhoods that have been losing people for half a century are now growing, whether or not they are adding housing units or not. A growth neighborhood cannot be portrayed just because you see construction. Significant increases in diversity in the suburban portions of Columbus and Columbus suburbs, significant increase of white households without school-age children moving inward. All of our growth is due to people of color. I believe that will likely continue for our region. And we have had an inadequate supply of new construction for 10 years. We're still stuck in that in 21, 22. Huge decrease in vacant housing across the county. And clearly our housing cost escalation is probably here to stay. This region is going to continue to grow. And you're seeing this manifest itself in neighborhoods all over the region. Here's a picture of a single family home next to a new build in the 5th by Northwest corridor. Here's a picture of a relatively new building in Italian Village, approved by an architectural review commission. The building looks great, but it has a scale difference here that we have to acknowledge. And all over Central Ohio, we're starting to see neighborhoods activate themselves in a response to growth. In Sharon Woods, right? There's a lot of signs in Sharon Woods about fighting Airbnb rentals. Here in Salem Village, where there's a lot of signs in Salem Village on the north side wanting to block a housing project that's happening in Claremont. Or here in German Village and Schumacher Place and Marion Village, where not only was there very sophisticated organization, but they hired legal counsel, they filed lawsuits, the project was ultimately approved, but really left everybody with not a good feeling, right? Because that's not how we want to do development. And generally, when a developer proposes a project on a site, now it's emotional, right? That's not the time to be having conversations about where do we put 1 million more people? What happens when Columbus goes from 900,000 people to 1.3 million? And in my own neighborhood, this is a sign in my front yard that I say, in my neighborhood, density means diversity, and more neighbors equals more fun. And apartments are awesome, and renters are welcome, and people are more important than fun. Because in my neighborhood, we've really embraced density and underparking and walkability because we're on that High Street and Fifth Avenue corridor. My neighborhood peaked at 8,000 people. 10 years ago, it was 4,000. It's back to 6,000. It will likely be to its peak year by the end of this decade. The growth of this region is going to continue. Wexner Medical Center, $2 billion, 5,000 jobs. Intel, 10,000 jobs. All that stuff on West Campus, Nationwide Children's Hospital. These are big projects with high-paying jobs. But if we don't build cities worthy of human affection, we won't build cities that people care about. And that's why things like the zoning code and architecture and density and walkability and mixture of uses and cultural competency are all really important, because we don't have weather and mountains and water, right? If we don't have a high quality built environment, we're not very competitive with Charlotte and Austin and other places. We will likely add 1 million people in the next 30 years. High Street right now represents really the brunt force of that huge shift, because you're seeing it from downtown all the way up to Old North Columbus as single-story buildings are getting knocked down for multi-story buildings. I think this is going to be the wave of the future. You're seeing it now on Fifth Avenue. I think on Fifth Avenue, from the railroad track next to Milo Grogan to just on the other side of the Olentangy River, which is just a couple miles stretch, there are 11 5- or 6-story buildings either under construction or will be under construction on Fifth Avenue. Fifth Avenue is going to feel very much like High Street in a relatively short period of time. I believe as we look to the future, we're going to have to just build more housing, and it's going to have to be more compact at an individual level. It'll have to be more density. If we do not build a more dense region, we will lose 700 square miles of farmland for development to accommodate that 1 million population growth. And that housing needs to be more diverse. Things like accessory dwelling units, where in my neighborhood, the neighborhood association, the area commission, and the city very much support doing accessory dwelling units. But if you want to do it, it's about 7 or 9 variances to get it done. So there's a lot going on, and there are 3 things that I think are really important for us to think about, and it will reshape our future. One is the $8 billion plan CODA is putting forward from Link Us. It may be on the ballot this fall. It is both building 3 high-capacity bus rapid transit lines, one up Olentangy River Road, one out East Main and West Broad, but it really begins to then be able to attract and build greater density around fixed stations. So it'll feel like a train, but it's really buses in a dedicated right of way. But Link Us is also about bike lanes and bike connectivity and sidewalks. It is really about building a complete city. Columbus is redoing its zoning code, which is 70 years old. All of it has been redone, but it doesn't really reflect the city of the future. It really does represent the city of present day, and in many ways, the city of the past. If you do not live in Columbus, I would ask you to say, what does your zoning code look like in your community? And does it support the regional growth strategies of the future? And then lastly, in 2019, for the first time ever, Columbus put $50 million into the bond package for affordable housing. The bond package, streetlights, bridges, sewers, and sidewalks. The city made the case that affordable housing is just as important to the city as sidewalks and bridges. They have now committed to $150 million into the bond package that will be on the ballot this fall. The $50 million was able to leverage 1,300 units and leverage $250 million. If you do not live in Columbus, is your suburban community using its bond package to actually break that barrier so more affordable housing could be built across the metropolitan region? I took up that time. There's a couple minutes left, but I'll let you facilitate a Q&A, and I can certainly stay to answer questions.